Hello, everyone. My name is David Remucal, and I'm Curator of Endangered Plants at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. For World Carnivorous Plant Day, I wanted to show you some of our native carnivorous plants, as well as the landscapes where they live. I also want to talk a little bit about how we work with these plants here at the Plant Conservation Program at the ARB. First off, I'll talk about where the native carnivorous plants in our state can be found. Most of the carnivorous plants in Minnesota are associated with water, either growing in it, in the case of Bladderworts, or right on top of it, or otherwise very close. In this picture is a lake in northern Minnesota. The vegetation in the foreground, like the green line below the trees on the opposite shoreline, is actually a floating mat. Vegetative material keeps accumulating on top of itself, maintaining this really interesting habitat that in some cases can eventually cover an entire body of water. Around this particular lake, there are at least 5 different carnivorous plant species, potentially more. Walking back a few feet from the edge, we can see some very obvious signs of some carnivorous plants without even having to get up close to the ground. Can you spot what I'm talking about? One of the species of carnivorous plants in here is flowering. It's not the pink flower at the bottom of the picture. That's an orchid. I'll point out some of the flowers that I'm talking about here, but once you see them, you'll be able to see a whole lot more in the picture. These are all purple pitcher flowering plant flowers. And these flowers are usually the first indication that you'll see that you're around some carnivorous plants in a spot. Stepping back a little further from the edge of the mat, you come to a wooded environment like this. We're still not on solid ground out here. These floating mats can be so thick and strong that they can hold up a whole black spruce forest habitat like this. All throughout this particular woodland habitat, there are pitcher plants and sundews spread out. Really, these 2 carnivorous plant species can be found in all kinds of conifer swamp habitat around the northern part of the state. When you get up closer to the floor of these floating mats, you can see why these plants can so often be overlooked. Often the swamps and floating mats are covered in a green carpet of sphagnum moss. Because the whole floor of these things are green, it's easy to overlook the other plants growing in it or on it. In this photo, there are both pitcher plants and sundews. You can probably see the pitcher plant on the left side of the picture without my help, but here it is. But it's a little harder to see all of the sundews on the right side of the photo, and there's quite a few. There's a whole bunch of sundews right in here. While they can be really common in these habitats, they can be a little hard to find unless you know what you're looking for. In late summer and fall, the pitcher plants and even some species of sphagnum can turn this really nice red shade of purple, making them really stand out. This picture points out one of the more interesting aspects of life on these living mats, though, besides the color. The ground for these plants is continually rising, meaning the sphagnum grows upward every year, growing on the back of itself, eventually smothering older parts of the mat. The plants living on this surface must figure out ways of floating, staying on top of the mats, really. In this picture, you can see some of the older pitchers almost completely covered. Sometimes the only parts of the pitchers that you see are the mouths of those pitchers, clearing a hole in the sphagnum, kind of like this one. Pitcher plants can be large enough to grow new leaves further up on a stem, potentially keeping pace with the rise of the sphagnum surface. For sundews, though, they are likely to have to employ a different strategy, as they are too small to grow upwards quickly enough to stay afloat. They probably rely on seed production every year to produce new plants that can stay at or near the top of the growing mat for a year or two, before those 2 will eventually need to be replaced. Here you can see the pictures of the pitcher plant stand out pretty easily against a mottled background. And this photo, we're stepping back towards the edge of the mat, back out in the open, away from the trees, and in a spot where the sundews are really thick. And at this time of year, they've also turned a nice kind of bright purplish red. Very easy to spot. These particular sundews are actually spoonleaf sundews. Also along this lake, there are some bladderwort species. And these are species that live in either mucky substrates or are completely aquatic, with these cool little traps that suck in the little creatures living in the muck or water around them. When they flower, they stick the flowers up on thin stalks to sit above the surface. So these all these yellow flowers here in the middle of this photo are the bladderwort flowers. These are horned bladderworts, to be specific in this particular picture. We do have one carnivorous plant species that does not live in those mats or in the water, and that is the common butterwort. Instead, in Minnesota at least, it lives on these harsh rocky environments on the north shore of Lake Superior. These relatives of bladderworts capture insects on sticky leaf surfaces, kind of similar to how sundews do. Here are some of these plants with some black splotches on the leaves, and those black splotches are actually insects that they have caught. While butterwort species in Minnesota grow exposed on hard surfaces, they do appear to be associated with these water drainage cuts that you can find in these larger rocky shields along the north shore of Lake Superior. This kind of illustrates the unexpectedness for many folks of having carnivorous plants native to northern Minnesota. A lot of people think of carnivorous plants as tropical, and the harsh freezing winters of Minnesota are certainly anything but tropical. And they present challenges for lots of plants to survive, let alone carnivorous plants, but many carnivorous plants have found ways to survive and thrive. Most of those plants do create little protected structures to overwinter their tender growing parts. So they leave their previously exposed leaves to die back. What's kind of cool about the pitcher plants, though, is not only do they keep their pitchers out and alive, they don't have a mechanism to drain the liquid in the pitchers, so they just let them freeze full of water. The butterwort species and this landscape in particular illustrates the importance of conservation work with carnivorous plants. Some of these kinds of plants in Minnesota, like the pitcher plant and the roundleaf sundew, are common, but many are not. In Minnesota, these butterworts only live on these really highly specialized habitats along the north shore of Superior. So there's really only a handful of these populations in the state. Several other of our carnivorous plant species are also state listed, including both sundew and bladderwort species. The mission of the Plant Conservation Program at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is to protect the rare plant species native to the state and region. And like many gardens and groups doing this kind of work, we do so in a few different ways. All the work we do, though, is based around research. We really want to try to learn from our work for the greater benefit of the conservation community at large. For these carnivorous plants, we typically focus on creating a long-term seed bank of populations of these species. This involves collecting and curating as much of the genetic diversity in a species range as possible, testing that seed and figuring out how to both grow and outplant that plant in different appropriate environments. In this way, we can effectively create a backup to that species, at least regionally, ensuring against future kind of catastrophic events like a smaller scale development and climate change on a larger scale. In general, carnivorous plant species produce what is termed orthodox seed, at least in Minnesota. That means the seed can typically be stored for extended periods of time by drying them down and then freezing them. Some species stored this way can last for many decades in a seed bank, potentially even more than a century. We grow some of these species out, not just to test for viability, but to display and use for education and outreach purposes. Carnivorous plants, as many of you know, are a wonderful plant ambassador. There aren't that many plants that are as evocative of the imagination as are some animals, the tigers, elephants, and pandas of the world. And carnivorous plants are right at the top of that list. By showing people some of these highly charismatic native plants, we can start to show them the importance of native plant conservation in general. Besides, who wouldn't love plants as cute as these little guys? These are some little baby round leaf sundew seedlings. Here's some more sundew seedlings, a little bit older, a little bit bigger. And here's some pitcher plant seedlings, another species we have very readily propagated by seed. Fortunately, many of our native carnivorous plants are both easily grown from seed and stored as seed, making them great candidates for conservation seed banking. Here's a sundew in our greenhouse that's captured a bunch of the little insect pests that we have in that kind of environment. So helping us out, which is great. That's my little tour of carnivorous plants, some of the carnivorous plants, I should say, in Minnesota and where they live. Just a quick warning for anyone wanting to go out and find any of these plants in our state. Part of the reason that many people don't even know that carnivorous plants grow in Minnesota is because they live in difficult spots to get to. And those spots can be kind of treacherous. The floating mat environment where the sundews and pitcher plants can be found can be really unreliable to walk on, especially close to the edge of the water. You can fall right through in some of those mats if you step on an unstable spot or get too close to the edge. The rock shields of the Butterworts, like in this picture, can be extremely slippery, especially in inclement weather. And if you slip, there's no soft place to land out there. So please be careful if you go out looking. And also do remember to try and minimize your impact on those landscapes. We want these plants to stick around. So let's be gentle out there. Thank you for your time and interest in carnivorous plants, for sure. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the plant conservation program here at the Arb, please email us or reach us at the website on this page. Otherwise, thank you very much and enjoy World Carnivorous Plant Day.
The International Carnivorous Plant Society wants you to be successful with your plants. We welcome growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. We started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate these spectacular plants. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.